So I don't do introductions. You may have realized I just jump right in. But I do think for talking with you, Tim, it's important for me at least to put a little context. I was looking back the other day. It's been five years since I joined Voicecraft, and I was thinking about that moment when I joined, and my daughter was 1, and I was having a very tough time. It was one of those moments of crisis. I've had a few of them. That was one of them. And Voicecraft will just always have, will always just have a very important place in my heart for that reason. It was something I found at a moment when, if I hadn't found it, I don't know where I would be. And I just wanted to put that front and center. It's been a huge part of something very important for me in terms of finding my own voice and figuring out what I want to say and who I want to speak with. And that's sort of part of where I was at that moment too, was wrestling with who is it that I spend my time with, and what kinds of conversations am I having, and why is there so much of what goes on inside me that I just keep in this little private realm. And it was just a godsend to find you and to find Voicecraft at that moment. So I wanted to put that front and center.
Oh, we can end it there. What a beautiful thing to say. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. I don't know that I've ever really expressed it to that degree to you before, but it's life-changing stuff, whatever it is that you're doing, Tim. It's life-changing stuff. It has been for me. And then therefore the flow-on effect too for all the people I interact with and the work that I do as well. So I'm curious about lots of things to do with Voicecraft. I'm also just curious about Tim as a person. I know those two things you can't just take those two things apart. So I think it makes most sense maybe if I start with some of the questions I have around Voicecraft. And sort of this, I've been thinking a lot about what community really is, and what it entails to build a sense of community. And that's where I just have a very deep respect for you, because I see what a mammoth task it must be, and the bravery that is required to go about just building years and years and years of building that. So I'm curious, I guess, if I just throw it out in a very open way to begin. I know I briefly mentioned this to you. What is it that drives you? In the sense, if we kind of keep it oriented towards, I'm thinking about Voicecraft. Why did you create Voicecraft? But it's not just the creating of it, which is a silly way to put it as well. I don't really know how to explain it. It's the nourishment of it and your commitment to it. Like, there's a way that you are committed to it that is very rare. And I'm curious about what drives that, what it is you find most meaningful, and what keeps you going in that.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it's a very difficult question. I did sit down to attempt to write about it, and I found myself even hesitating to narrativize it too concretely,
Sure.
even though there are a lot of different images that come to mind. The question of drive it's an interesting one because what drives me makes it as if it's a separate question from the me. And so there is a sense, I wonder if what's driving us is, in a sense, always a tiny bit unknowable. And we can narrativize it in different ways. So I can tell different stories from my childhood and mix them together with aspects of my personality, which have been pretty stable over the years. And the feeling, the sense, the significance of being in conversation with people in a meaningful way always struck me as a young boy as, ah, this is a good thing to be doing, you know. But also, it was the kind of context that things, certain things which came up. I remember, for instance, walking along, we were going to a restaurant, and I was walking along next to my dad, and we were talking about war, but not really talking about war because he was consistently trying to get me to stop asking questions about it. And I remember the affect of him resisting speaking about something that was clearly extremely meaningful, and his block to wanting to speak about it more felt like a bar between me both understanding something about the world more deeply and also being closer and in touch with him. And so I had the feeling of,
Mm,
is it wrong for me to be asking about this? But it can't be wrong for me to be asking about this because actually you were just that little bit more open before and it seemed really important. Now, the context of that conversation, I can't really remember. I would have been for sure under 8 or 9 years old. But my grandfather, my dad's dad, he fought in World War II. And shortly before he died, in the last sort of conversation, and in fact, the only conversation I ever had with him about his experiences in the war, he all of a sudden just pulled me aside and in the spare bedroom, and it was dim in there, and we sat on the edge of the bed together, and he just started recounting his experience of being a gunner in Malta. When it was under siege, and if I understand correctly, within that period of time, it was under siege, at least weeks to some months. It was the most bombed place in the whole of the war. Now, I could be wrong on that, but that's what I have in mind. And, he's a gunner, so he's trying to shoot down the planes. And he says to me, sometimes I like to think we hit one. But he didn't say it as a joke. But, he was maybe the only one of the friends he had there who survived, right? Because the most bombed place, and he's trying to shoot down the planes. And so I imagine that attacking the people shooting down the planes was in the interest of the Luftwaffe. And, you know, why sharing this story? Well, in the case that that's maybe why my dad didn't want to speak about war so much, but there's something there, right? There's a sort of, in a sense, whether the on the many occasions those planes released the bombs, whether it was a split second earlier or later, I'm sure would have made a difference between whether he was blown up. And so here we are having this conversation. And so there's something there, I guess we could see as, yeah, I wouldn't say it's a foundational myth of our family. It was never spoken about. And I'm sure there could be many more. You could maybe write in an infinite number, over the course of our ancestry. But it was nevertheless extremely significant and was also a subject in this case that wasn't as open to speak about as one might think it could be, to the degree that as a family, you might try and process and integrate who you are and where you've come from. And so that's just one example of a feeling of significance I had where there was a kind of meaning and intimacy that was barred for reasons I didn't understand and yet seemed to some degree could be mediated through relationship, and in this case, in conversation. I could give many more, and that would only be the very slightest angle into sort of what drives me, just looking at it at the level of, early experiences and what have you. And we probably come at it from 7 or 8 different dimensions, and I think they would all end in a question, which is, the story is very much in process. And, if I was to reflect back in 20 years' time, you know, if anyone reading some of the books or journals I've written over the years were to come to their own assessment, then there may be things that have happened which I'm unaware of or I'm not factoring, or which are yet to happen, which could entirely rewrite the sense of how it is people might understand what's driving me. So it is a bit of a mystery, but I love to bring people together. I do love to connect with people. I love to be part of creativity. I love to face up to and attend to what is significant. I'm very attuned to when significance or intimacy or possibility, deep relevance,
Mhm.
quality is either welcomed or not welcomed. I'm quite attuned to when there are membranes put up here or there, and I feel I'm quite attuned to how those connect with the broader sort of ecology of relations and understanding which are informing a context. And so, they're just some other things which I find to both sort of activate me in the sense of I'm interested in the possibilities of how understanding and communication work together, but I'm also interested in how our sense of value and quality and significance in life is also woven through those processes and already conditions them. So I'm interested in the broader world, the background, the the constraints which are also constituting who we are, how we're treating each other, what we're doing in the world, what there is to do, what we should be doing. All of that is, in a sense, just an interest in philosophy as well. And so I see sort of philosophy as, in many respects, sort of like a catch-all for embodied participation in transformative understanding,
Mhm.
basically. So that's the beginnings of a response.
Yeah, I think the fact that you even start off by for grounding that we can't know really ultimately we can't, and the ways that we go about grasping to know what it is that drives us. I think that in and of itself is just very is telling in and of itself. That's quite a hard thing, I think, for some people to let go of, the idea that they just can consciously access all these things. But the thing that's front of mind I really want to ask you is, do you remember when your grandfather took you into that room, and he told you, all of a sudden he opened up and he told you everything, or part of it? Do you remember what that was like for you? Do you remember sort of more of the affective experience?
Yeah, I was conscious that I couldn't say much, and just being present in the way that he was comfortable with me being present was sort of necessary in order to just see through what was willing to come forward. It didn't last long, probably only like 2, 3 minutes. And he was at that point, his mental faculties were deteriorating a little bit. He was well over 90, and he was also, I think, uncomfortable sharing emotionally anyway. And he was also tired. So I think immediately after he went into his bedroom, and I don't think I saw him again on that trip. I think he might have gone to sleep and then we were leaving, it's kind of in the afternoon. So I more of a sense of just being witness to a moment more than anything else.
Yeah, something very yeah, there's something very intimate about that. Just just sort of I'm imagining the scene. Obviously, it wasn't there, but just the sense that he there was a moment and he chose to take you aside and sort of almost open up to you. It's almost it's more than a passing along. It's sort of a it sounds quite defining, is what I'm trying to say. The fact that there was a choice to open up and to open up to you, and all it takes is a couple of minutes, about something that had been so silenced, and even the fact that you knew in that moment to sort of like the way that you're describing it, to be there, to witness it, to sort of allow it to come out, to treat it in a very sort of precious manner. Um, I see so much of that in you now, I guess, in the way that you kind of steward, I don't know the words you would use, but the way you sort of steward conversation and dialogue, and moments of intimacy within community. So I just wonder about, I mean, we can only ever wonder, can't we? I just wonder about, without that one particular moment in your life. without that one particular decision on the part of your grandfather to share with you in that moment, even though, yeah, it sounds like it took a lot out of him, but
Yeah.
something in that moment, yeah.
No, it is fascinating. It's, as I said, there's a number of images, and we
Mm,
could go through the portal of any number of them. And as I'm with it now and hearing you and sharing it, I actually am sort of on the edge of, I'm close to tears.
I can tell.
And that's, I've told that story a few times, but I don't know, is the truth, how seminal that was. It was probably about 10 years ago now, maybe 9 years ago. And I don't think I would have recounted it as particularly relevant to Voicecraft,
Mm,
but it is certainly relevant to, I would say, not an entirely process. I mean, at some level, I don't really know if I'm one for, once you cry about it, that means it's processed. But and maybe it's more than appropriate for the emotion of that to always be refindable for me. And so I have reflected on it, the degree to which it informs my sense of the contingency of life. I'd sort of put that in the backpack with all the many other experiences of finitude one has, but it's certainly a significant one. And I also think it's quite it's a remarkable story that was never really legitimized to me by anyone else, and so I have not studied the Siege of Malta tremendously. I've read the Wikipedia, and he didn't go into detail,
mm,
but in looking into it, it is quite remarkable, and it is incredibly contingent. And there is something about that in life that I think I do find as a source of affirmation,
mm,
whether it's playing in this football match or knowing these people, being part of an evening, a conversation. I do find it ready to hand the the desire, but also just the resting sense of affirming the context I'm a part of. I don't know if that's what people call being present, right? Or just valuing things.
mm,
But I do find it rather natural to accept the significance of my own life, not as a biography, but as a just here we are together in this moment, in this context. And actually, that is where the magic is to be found, right? It's always on the pulse of how we meet the moment, meet each other, accept and discern our way in relation to what is moving us and what we may contribute to the moving of. And so maybe it's the case that having a certain sense for the just absurd contingency of our lives is one way that someone can come to recognize that all they can ever do is, in fact, affirm the meaningfulness of what they are actually a part of as part of the process of moving anywhere at all, even if that involves a rejection. But anyway, again, not sure if that's how I came to it or if I'm particularly adept at it. But I do think that when it comes to conversation and community and the value of experiences, then that sense of really tuning into or returning to, in sort of the language that I would use, the return to that channel, that context, uh, as a source from which a becoming or creativity can then enter more proximately, more intimately, more appropriately, even if not intimately, right? Wherever that edge is, can we joke? Where's the boundary? All of that actually sense where we can be with each other. And that, I think, is probably to the degree that capacity is transmitted, in a group, among each other, then I think that speaks to something very fundamental around what enriches and enlivens contexts, relationships.
Yeah, there's something I mean, I know you've thought very seriously and deeply about it for many years, but there's also something I imagine that is just an intuitive sense that you have of being able to do that sort of thing. Though there is, this is why as well I keep coming back to the word courage. There is something very courageous about being willing to put yourself into a space where um, where you are, yeah, you're willing to be rejected, you're willing to be pushed back, you're willing to be met with the silence again, and to continuously be, these are my words, not yours, I know they're clumsy, but it's almost like a continuous fine tuning that's going on, right? To just stay present in the space and to contend to sort of keep returning. That's a very tall order for most people to be able to hold that. Um, and you do it. And so I'm curious, does that feel like something in particular that you have that you sort of would look back on, maybe like older conversations you've had and you've really seen yourself grow in that way? Or that seems like something that was always calling to you, something that you felt an urge to step into, a need to be there and hold it in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. One way I'd approach it, I sometimes I well, I'm going to say something which some people may find offense in. I don't mean it like that, but I am wanting to point to a distinction that I think I've noticed and have spoken to for some years. Some people become, whether it's, and I'm not picking on any one of these categories, but whether it's facilitators or coaches or whether they've gone to workshops to develop skills at empathic or non-violent communication. I'd even going further down the gradient, and maybe there's a difference in kind here, so I say this with humility, but further down the gradient, I'd see things like NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and a whole bunch of applied psychology, and I use that in quotation marks, for the sake of developing a skill that makes you more effective at communication, usually in some instrumentalizing strategic way. And I'm not saying that facilitation is manipulative. I'm not saying that. But there's a similar, in the stories of some people who really find and make their identity and profession in the world, they are experiencing a lack, and maybe it's a lack of their own capacity. And so they seek out the skills and learn how to do it so they can address it. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do. In many respects, it's a beautiful thing to do. But I don't believe that's my path into this. So I have the story about myself that when it comes to sort of attunement and participation in relationship, I'm actually I'm skeptical of uh, being too procedural or following a rule book or practice book for how to go about doing that. And that the complexity of really meeting the moment in order to trust that the the kind of the wellspring or the where the mutual possibility for connection or magic, used poetically, but maybe not, because magic speaks to something of a kind of an impossible to specify in advance timing of of some constellation coming together, which opens the system where it previously was perceived maybe as closed. And so right timing, I really do like one of the question types. Forrest Landry, a philosopher, corresponds the question type when he corresponds it to mysticism, which I always thought was like a very profound insight, or at least recognition. And that seems to me to be the case. And so there's a certain timing that I I trust the sort of the living history of mess over the course of our lives that we cultivate in an attempt to be able to find the right timing. I trust that. And I do believe that I've been like all humans do, you know, facing that, like being, attuning myself to that moment of did what I just say help or did it fuck things up, And like, did that work or not? And so I've always been attending to that. And so,
That's moment to moment attunement though, see.
yes,
And this is, I think, again, very different because that can be very taxing, is one way of putting it. That can feel like it's going to be very taxing for people. So the alternative that can be on offer, to learn a procedure, learn a set of techniques, apply them. It can seem very compelling to people for that reason. That moment to moment attunement is also scary, is sort of one way of putting it. Because as you're speaking, I'm thinking a lot too about the parallel with, a kind of therapy that I do, which is that a similar kind of, like, it's the really being there. It's not, you're not there applying something. But that letting go in order to be able to be there in that way requires a willingness to, though, to go into the dark places, if we say that, just sort of to not know. And I do think that that sounds like something that you just, for whatever sense, intuitively do well. I don't know how else to put it. Seem drawn to, or are capable of, or and I wonder about ways that we go about, and maybe this leads into Voicecraft, but ways that we go about creating spaces for people to get more comfortable at doing that sort of thing for themselves, to get a taste of it and then to be able to do it. But
yes,
that's a very different thing to, obviously, selling a workshop on, here's a set of skills you're going to learn to be able to apply for, for leadership,
right.
yeah.
And it's especially because I have thus far attempted to conduct myself in the same mode of integrity with respect to this across different contexts and membranes,
Mm-hmm.
even where, in principle, that mode simply doesn't go. The question of whether it speaks to something really interesting, actually. There's a sense of whether or not one must accept when a certain relational context must be navigated through transaction, i.e., there's an institutional or corporate form through the gatekeeper across the different levels of the organization that has to be adhered to in order to then maybe later have a possibility of stepping into some kind of depth
Mm-hmm.
of real connection. Now, pragmatically, most people would say, like, obviously the answer is yes, and you'd be foolish and awkward to think anything otherwise. And I have time for that perspective from a pragmatic conversational viewpoint. And certainly, if I'm in a football match, the referee is the referee, and I'm not going to be knocking him off his role of referee unless shit really hits the fan. Like maybe someone's had their head smashed in and the ref's not noticing, and the ref himself is having some sort of head loss and he needs to be shaken out of his role. Like return to soul, return to presence here. And that becomes the question. It's how much our instrumentalizing can become a barrier to actually welcoming and connecting with soul.
Mm.
And so the question that you're sort of pointing towards speaks to it ends up speaking to, can we approach, you know, becoming cultivation, education at a level of ecology that doesn't require or doesn't lean on a prescripted instructional set, but can also help to shape and steward and support the
Mm.
the cultivation of the cultivation of psyche and relation. There'd be a better way to, I know you're following, we're in touch with the same thing here. And the question, so for me just to put for me to put a bow on it, just for this part of the conversation of what we're building here together, whether what we're doing is sufficiently, like, are we really giving what we could within the bounds of, again, a sort of ethics of what we can give without giving too much to the point of collapse? There's a mediation function there, but are we giving as much as we would actually really dream of giving, and that could support the possibility of a collective dreaming in that context, to the possibility of soul being part of the process of relationship, rather than just going through the motions, which through their modes of transaction and already existent forms actually could end up blocking the capacity for soul to be present when we most need it. And so, and I do, certainly there's been both a courage, and I can say that because that courage has been bound up with a foolishness with respect to how I've attempted to go about building the possibility of relationships with people, particularly beyond the voicecraft context. You know, there's a sense in which this, within the context of voicecraft as you and I know it, in the sense of the network, although, you know, you could zoom into different areas of the history, and you know, even as things will continue to develop, that will speak, well, that's going to be particularly challenging. It's not like that's all smooth sailing, but by and large it's unbelievably smooth sailing. I would never look at myself as someone who, you know, I'm showing courage because I'm like showing up with like a friendly spirit among my friends. You know what I mean? It's like we're all courageous, aren't we? Pat on the back, right? But there is that, where the courage comes in touch with foolishness, is quite interesting, you know.
Oh.
But I do think that tension regarding, can soul connect here? How constrained, how tight are those governing constraints on whether it's possible to actually open up into relationship here? You know, and I hope, I say I hope, I feel I've always been and will continue to be, and it would become a very serious moment of reflection should I not be or not act in the way of really, really pulling the veil back, so to speak, on the the transactions or the momentums of power that um, could otherwise occlude where the soul, where the psyche is really attempting to just express and meet in integrity in a given situation. Because if we don't tend to that, then I'm doubtful that the fabric of a broader ecology at level of both spread and scale. I know that Daniel obviously will speak about spread. I would at this point prefer to keep them both as part of the conversation, because I think, in a sense, the language of scale becomes important to recognizing when we're in actually in a kind of direct trade-off relationship with potential junctures, which could serve as leverage for supporting growth at the level of scale, which, given we are also quantitative beings in a process together, I think is relevant, right? And then the spread in the sense of, you know, resonance and how we share with each other and what sort of transmitted in various ways and mode, the ways of treating each other that support the becoming of people without sort of over determining that from some controlling perspective, but actually supporting the sort of immanent local grounds of their being. All of that, like, sort of absolutely necessary for me, like table stakes. But then the tension surrounding where, what aspects, what junctures of the social world as it presently exists are we and can we come into better relationship with? I think this discernment around soul and whether it's welcome and how to actually mediate that and what the trade-offs are given time and energy, that's a continued question for me. And I approach it, the final thing I'll say, I approach it as a question oftentimes in reflection because my natural orientation is not to be strategic in that way. And I will make the contention that I don't believe that being strategic first when it comes to this precise phenomena can be successful. So I think it's incorrect, but that doesn't mean I don't think it's not part of the discerning process that's in the mix. Um, but it's, what it's, a lot of this comes down to, you know, what is one, what of one's own conduct is one rests well in one's psyche, in one's conscience. And in that regard, what can one be sort of affirm they're living with and obviously giving everything for. So yes.
So much to say. But where you're getting to there at the end, though, can just continuously reminds me of like what you're talking about too, though, is your own you're being in touch with your own soul, if we put it in those terms, like this. I know this is just simple crude language, but it's like it's the 1 foot in oneself and 1 foot outside, and the being, truly being with that. That's what I'm hearing from you there. I am really curious to hear more, Tim, about what goes on for you when you are making that discernment. And also probably linked to that, potentially the same question, just in another form, is what is actually happening, and what is happening for you when you are feeling, I know this isn't right, but sort of feeling out those dynamics in a dialogue. Like what is actually going, how would you put words to the experience of what is happening, what you're doing? These are all wrong words, but
No, not at all. So no, it's an awesome question. It's something which I can definitely find a way to speak to, and I'll try and find the level of abstraction that I'm comfortable with in this context, because a lot of this really can point, you know, there are real edges here to share. And in part, some of the contexts of relevance regarding where those edges show up may not necessarily care for those edges in the way that I would hope and, like, the vulnerable parts of me would desire. So now I said that quite abstractly, but um, there are certain edges that are worth sharing in good company, and others you want to be a bit more cautious about in not so good company. Now and then, but we can bracket it up initially as the kind of conversations that many people might associate with coming to a Voicecraft session or stepping into a podcast about a topic. And those to me are, these are uh, these are just awesome experiences. This is fun enjoyment, but deeper than that, significant and meaningful, and one can really locate themselves and undergo sort of transformative understanding in that way, and they can contribute to the commons in a whole bunch of ways. I'm not limiting those, but they're, in a sense, it's like there's an element of them that is it can be closer towards play. And so uh, I would say a very different set of things around how I enter those and where my edges are in them, where I think I'm contributing more or less. And so, I'll often joke like I didn't, I behaved myself so well until this point, at which point I may have started to indulge a little bit more in thoughts or questions or seekings that weren't as connected as they could be. It was valuable for me to undergo, but I'm taxing attention a little bit more, and I could have passed the ball earlier, but people can kind of sense that I'm doing something interesting with the ball, but and we can all sense that, right? And that's there. And then there's this other bracket of context for communication that we're talking about. I pause on that word as a brief tangent because in a conversation some months ago, was very strongly, we can talk about this, off air, but very strongly critiqued for the language of context of communication, with scorn and mockery. And I get it, but also
The same context of communication.
context of communication, yeah. Because for me, it keeps showing up as an important, like, abstract signifier of various contexts of communication. Not every conversation is the same. And that's partly what we're speaking about, right? And so, anyway, in this other type of communication where maybe someone is not uh, trusting yet, does not feel rapport with me, or senses that if they were to drop a little bit deeper or open up to certain questions, it might be unsettling for their institutional place or status among people who might be listening, or just in their own self, for their own self-regulation. So many different factors there, obviously at the psychological level in terms of what one's open to and all of that, and how to approach discerning in those contexts obviously is going to be colored very differently. And my energy was more speaking to this second category. So I'm often more drawn towards the, like, here are some of the edge case negativities where sort of all my effort and dedication has been like dashed against the rocks. And so oftentimes in sort of public conversation over the years, what I've done is, like, someone's asked me something and I've been like, oh, I've just been failing so much. And the way that that can be perceived, I think, by people listening in general, although people might say otherwise if they're being reflective and say someone who's in some way leading an initiative, if they to if they speak to their failings and negativities they're encountering, well, that's a good sign of a leader, surely, right? Because they're being open and reflective. But I think it is also the case that when people hear uh, leaders expressing doubt, then they think this person mustn't be particularly good at what they're doing. And so
Mm.
the the very um, the very movement I have with toward pointing out or welcoming into attention genuine challenge, tension, negativity, all of this is, on the one hand, one of it's a helpful way of actually connecting with people and working with what's real, and at the same time can also uh, create, it can also not serve the initiation of certain collaborations. I don't think I'm a confidence man exactly, while at the same time, in certain ways, I will also express extremely confidently. So,
Hmm.
and it's important to me to, and if I'm right about that, I think that's a worthwhile thing to actually aspire to, because it means that if I'm open to collaborating with somebody and I say I would, I'm down to do this or I will do this, then those words should carry weight, And now, after, having been building Voicecraft for so many years, and I would say that in general, in a collaborative sense, people would say I'm, reliable, as reliable as you would, you know, reasonably expect someone to be. And maybe more so. And so, but how do you get to that point of really sensing whether you can trust somebody in that regard? I think being able to share where genuine problems are or tension is part of doing that. Can it be done? Do I do that sometimes? Can I tend towards doing that sometimes too much? Like as a meta reflection, the very searching for this question and answer to it right now is an example of that. I don't think because I definitely don't think the value of this conversation revolves around this particular question, but I do think it's like a deep one that ends up being a subtle thing you're not even noticing, profoundly is orienting. Because if I'm showing up with a sense of the if I'm showing up with a sense of if that's translating in me as a kind of a heaviness, like the weight of contingency, then that can be interpreted in all manner of ways. And so then one might say, well, is there a certain processing or lightness? Have you gone to the sauna? Have you done enough exercise? You don't want to be carrying any extra energy that isn't circulating properly around the body. So someone can just like fob you off for completely random reasons. But you're never going to get rid of all the projection anyway. And it's totally remarkable how people can be, I'm very used to some people really, feeling like, what the hell, and really not liking and really not resonating. Um,
Mm,
but I just do think that that exact dance is just so necessary for really finding and connecting with the people who you can build the kind of almost like, oh, if we bring it back to something like Voicecraft, something like the pre-institutional social fabric that's sufficiently resonant at the level of soul and trust so as to actually begin to start connecting more complex responsibilities that are held in a sense um, diffusely uh, given the mess of what seemingly wants to come into coordination in a world which is basically consistently working against that type of coordination. And I do agree with this, why I've resonated in some ways with people like Nora Bateson and their thinking so much, because at the level of the off scriptness and not specifying rules in advance, all the complexity types and what have you, that's always been really natural to me. And that wasn't something that came through as like, here's an understanding of complexity. It was like, well, we are all of us to the degree we're alive, like to the degree we're vital, capable of engaging with complexity. And so these are like, how much is one really attending to what's constituting their intelligence basically, and it's wisdom, I suppose. What can be what what needs to be said, and what is maybe more what's more beneficial or more valuable, more appropriate to hold unsaid and give over in a sense to the trust of someone's local context, you
mm,
know and so
yes.
and just as a point then to bring it back toward how I even think about community and what have you, it's very on one hand very lightly and sensitively, which is to say that for what voicecraft is and how it's manifested in different times and in some ways in different dimensions depending on which people are populating its dimensions at any given time, is that it's it's really being very sensitive to um, not asking the wrong things of people, not asking too much, and I think it's really important to really really important to affirm someone's local imminent discernment regarding their own privacy, while at the same time to, if one can, with again sensitivity, understand the appropriate door to knock on to just suggest if you would like to meet in this location, uh, that could be a good idea, right? And then we can meet there and hang out there, and then that builds, in a sense, a kind of another node or a bridge that is now connecting privacy together. And I would say, in general, um, people can superimpose their sense of what ought to be shared, what someone else ought to be sharing,
Mhm.
in a way that they're just like they're almost not always, obviously, but one can be totally lost in projection doing that, just so totally lost in projection. And
Yeah.
all of this is just a whole lot, for me, it's a whole lot slower. And then all of a sudden, things are going to happen anyway. Do you know what I mean? Things are going to happen anyway. And you could, you know, like just in the same way that I shared that particular image and story of my grandfather, we could find any number of angles into what is, you know, far away from the complete ideal, if there were, which I don't, necessarily believe there is such a thing, always a process. We could find all these inadequacies in me as ways to angle into the what is still in becoming as a psyche, and we could look at everybody like that if you wanted to. Um, and so you could spend you're lost if you're just doing that, basically. And so yeah, there is something that I feel people who share the understanding that some psychologists and therapists and healers have with respect to, and mentors and wise people have, is that really caring for connecting with and being present to the glint in the eye of someone's potential, but also where that potential connects with their essence without over determining what that essence is, while at the same time being like ready and present to like extend the hand and shake the hand of that essence if it wants to step forward. There's something just in there as a natural phenomenon that I think is, you
Mm.
know, is a human, we will just go with human, but that is a human faculty and capacity without which there is no community, there is no, it's just, we're just totally lost if we don't have that. It's on the one hand something of humility, on the other hand something of the deepest aspiration, it's something of lightness, it's something of heaviness, it's indefinable, and yet at the same time, when someone meets you in that way, it is obviously of the most felt affirmative sense of belonging as the essence of friendship, of care, and in that regard is the most exoteric thing ever, It's so basic. It's so basic.
Mm. Yeah, that's what love and care is. Um, yeah, the question I often sort of have as sort of a bit of a basic guide, I guess if you put it like that, is just an asking what is being avoided, like just sort of what is being avoided. But people can hear that and take that to be what is being avoided, and the moment you become aware of it, quick, make it present right now, right, point it out. But what is being avoided is just sort of a starting point, and then there are, like the way you just laid that out was so beautiful. um, it's not just having an eye to what might be being avoided, it's also staying in very attuned relationship with each individual, and a noticing of where it might be a moment to press on or share what part of what you're sensing might be being avoided, and then the how you go about that, and then there's just this level of attunement to an individual where you really are, for lack of better words, you really are trying to feel, the threshold, to feel what is, what is what is the way I could, or is it even possible that there is any way I could in this moment share something of what I'm sensing about what is being avoided in a manner that is actually going to be caring and loving, and then, you know, generative and all these things. Or is it going to collapse this person? Is it going to be corrosive? Is it going to, is it going to give rise to, exactly like you're saying, a whole set of projections now? And I think what happens, and I used to see a lot of, which is part of what drew me into wanting to take part in some of these conversations. I would see a lot of in other places. I'm not referring to Voicecraft here. Is people become people get a taste of that, of being able to notice that they can sense something like, oh, that might be being avoided, and they want to start to press the buttons, right? They get it's almost like the God complex. They want to press the buttons and they feel very effective that way. And to me, that is just such a but it's very easy. It's very easy to fall in that direction if you're not always paying attention, I think. So it does, this is part of what's required in the very careful attention all the time. The getting lost in this sort of godly feeling within oneself that, oh, I could press on that right now. I could point that out. Without this bedrock of care and love that you're talking about. And the word that always used to spring to mind for me whenever I used to think about voicecraft, and like why was it I was so drawn to voicecraft, and what was happening when I would attend, was the word nourishment. And I mean that in like the deepest sense. It was a form of nourishment that was just sort of missing in my life, and was not a form of nourishment that I loved that whole space online of listening to all the podcasts and the conversations and all the different groups of people doing philosophy together. But it was Voicecraft in particular that I really felt that that's part of what made it different somehow. It didn't, and I mean this in a broad sense of the term, but it didn't feel like a whole lot of egos bumping up against each other in a room trying to, acting like we're there to just have a conversation, but really you can sense that there's this kind of competitiveness underneath. There's something about the love and the care that sits at the heart of how, I don't know. I'm sure that's because of what you bring to it, but it's the people it attracts as well, though. I guess and that is definitely my experience, and for that I am so thankful. But I think you're exactly right that this is about, first and foremost, trying to remain as humanly connected as possible, and to not have it be this sort of pursuit of, pursuit of knowledge or ideas or something at the forefront. It's actually the human connection that is, or for me anyway, that is primary in all of this. And without that, it doesn't really matter what, from my point of view, it doesn't really matter what else gets generated.
Yeah. Well, there's a sense in which I really agree with you. And I think that I had dinner with Rahul the other day. He came down to visit Melbourne, and he one of the ways he described my philosophy of not that we were talking about my philosophy exactly, but he's listened to the podcast and he's heard me speak, and he said something like, relationship first or something like this is what he said. And that, that could maybe be seen in a similar light as to what you've just expressed there. And there's a sense in which that's true. I, you know, I wouldn't immediately formalize what other categories go along and sort of interweave with that in a sort of a similar level of depth. But, you mentioned sort of knowledge, for example, maybe that could serve as one, and maybe value we could play with as another. And yeah, obviously relationships are valuable, but then there's also so without formalizing, I also see that you know, to cultivate relationship, I mean, we are obviously part of the world. Like we can't not like if we're really deepening relationship, then we are also attending to real patterns in the world. And so whether the focus is on I think for the nourishment,
Mm,
all of it has to be part of the process. And maybe some people emphasize the holding of some pieces more than others. You know, in the tribal sense, some people have gone and gathered food to bring it back, and then there's stories around the fire, and all of it is contributing. But the relationships are not going to hold together very long unless there's obviously those types of other nutrients coming in too. And so I think one of the aspects which Voicecraft has had within it is this sense of the different kinds of archetypal dispositions
mm,
toward participating in conversation, as well as the different kind of cognitive styles. That's a word that Cam uses sometimes, or he used to use years ago to describe. And, there's different ways to break down what those are. I don't have like a fixed categorization system of how I divide up cognitive styles among human beings, but there's lots of ways that do. Everything, at a what has influenced my work philosophically is at least, being able to explore the differences between the intellect and intuition, or analysis and mysticism, or that more, obviously on the McGilchrist side of things, the whole left hemisphere, right hemisphere. You have one that's more to do with quantity, the other more to do with quality and the patterns which connect. And I think that in really attending to what can both come up from the depths through one's psyche, or maybe from the unconscious that might be profoundly personal, while at the same time having a deep transpersonal significance. So, in that regard, tending to what can come up in relationship as such as foundational. But to actually be able to do that, of course, is like, you know, if not knowledge, then it requires a certain kind of wisdom, right? It might not be codified as knowledge, but you could imagine the people in the tribe who are capable of recognizing a particular anguish or experience or desire or whatever someone's expressing because they've seen in a reflection of it before, and so they can be with it. And so having in that regard a sense of what really constitutes human beings and psyche in cultural relation as an open question, as a continually updating process, but nevertheless as something which can be um, a base of knowledge and wisdom that can be developed regarding that, as well as then looking out more towards the external. So, the nature that we come to learn of, which maybe we can glean through understanding ourselves, but we might primarily more see in observing the external world, different things reflected back to us, and of course the world of philosophy and metaphysics and all the disciplines, inform the integrity of connections between these. And so I personally have like I wouldn't say like I'm interested. All of it to me is part and parcel of understanding, to participate in understanding. And so Um, I'm I'm I wouldn't even rank what my interests are. I just know that the importance of someone's authentic
mm,
expression as part of their own learning journey is of the same essential aspirational value as someone who is authentically recounting some great archetypal tale. Now, obviously, like Homer has probably done a better job than, someone writing a story for their first time in terms of what, he's conveying. But the spirit of receptivity to what is actually wanting to come through in that is there to be cultivated and is required to actually receive the source of the understanding regardless. And so
mm,
whether it's because one is stretching to understand some tremendously complex idea or story with so many meanings they haven't encountered before, or whether one is, you know, receiving someone's contribution, which is just attempting to chip away at the edges of some profound like vein of insight to tap, and they're just getting there. The capacity to actually receive what is wanting to be expressed there is there to cultivate regardless. Now, this isn't to collapse like all distinction as to what is contributing to some high bandwidth, many dimensional understanding, and yet at the same time, it is to make the radical point. I've always been really moved by the necessity, what I see as a necessity of, you know, can you imagine a conversation happening on stage and it being utterly unmoved by like some outcry in among those who are listening, and not just a baby crying because they needed food and someone's obviously going to take care of that, but someone in genuine pain or something that was really felt to be, in principle, all of that which is in energetic witnessing entangled relation to that is part of what is constituting the understanding and the belonging and all of that in question. And obviously everyone, regardless of where they're sitting, is navigating their own membranic relation to whether one should speak or not, right? And it's and so I'm at different events I've held and in different contexts, I've held, I sometimes can have a presence of, if I remember, so once, there was some chatter, we were in the theater and I wasn't expressing, someone else was, and I knew that they were struggling in a sense to express themselves on stage at that time. It was really on the edge for them. Someone who hadn't been able to come along, and so some people had stepped in, and there were some people in the audience who I knew who were having a conversation to each other. Now, this was a seated audience, like literally at a theater, and it was quite audible. And for me, uh, it happened one, two, little nod, three times, and then I caught one of the people's eye, and I communicated that should end. So and I am often holding a presence of where my sense of some of the boundaries I want to hold more strongly are, and I could be wrong about those. So yeah, it is not about flattening, but at the same time, it is about, um, whatever is discerning also must hold itself to the same humility of receptivity to what is actually constituting the process.
Yeah, it's holding all these things at once. Um, you said before something, you were talking, and then you said at the end, it's basic. It's so basic. And what I wanted to say is that all these things you're describing, Tim, are so they require such maturity. Like they're not. I know what you mean by basic, but they are very much in opposition to what I would call uh, the the way that I guess things are designed currently, the way that people kind of unfold just through that process, right, and come to be in the world, is really set up in opposition to some of the sorts of things you're describing. And what I mean by that is even just being able to hold more than one feeling at once. Not like, there's just so much to what you're describing, being able to be with multiple motivations at once, to maybe feel the pull to prioritize towards one, but to discern whether or not that is a pull to listen to or not, like where is that coming from and what would that lead to? And there's just so much in the way that you're talking about how you relate and how you I know facilitate's not the right word. I don't really know what the right word is, but steward maybe is a better word. That is remarkable to me, that there were aspects of what you were talking about earlier that I was just thinking as you were talking, sound like the kinds of things that, that follow someone, being psychoanalytically trained, and then and then doing just like years and years. Like, there's so much maturity in what you were saying, and the ways that you, I guess what I'm asking in all of this is, how much of this have you felt you're really consciously um, working on or sculpting, or sort of, versus how much of it is just naturally available to you, if that makes sense. So it is I'm on the same stream really as I have been the whole way. I'm trying to get a sense of, um, and I know chronology it's not always helpful, but trying to get a sense of, when you look back, are there aspects of this that have really shifted for you, that you've had very big learning experiences around and you've very consciously tried to, do you know what I'm saying? Or is it's, yeah.
There's certainly been lots of things that I've learned. I, there's part of me which is hesitant to just say like comes naturally because like what is, but
But I
I
wonder,
do
yeah.
think I don't think I would be in the position I'm currently in, which when it when I reflect on where I am and the prospect of, well, if I just like hit slash delete on Voicecraft or something, and where would and I just cancelled everything, cut all possible. I mean, it's madness to even imagine. The truth is that I can't even get through the thought experiment of it. You know what I mean? Because I actually am not really a fan of thought experiments taken to the extreme, because I think that you end up you divorce yourself from the actual entanglement which constitutes the thinking,
I,
basically.
I agree.
It, there is a certain sense in which, if we're considering virtualized possibilities, then I think it has some critical value. But anyway, um, there's been a number of things that I've learned. There have been naiveties that I've lived, which I think actually, in the end, are some of the thing. Without remembering those naiveties, I'd be totally in the dark as to why certain mishaps and have befallen me, and certain, I've experienced some, without going into details in this context right now, but I've experienced some significant um, social, I would just say, I've experienced some significant reputational damage for effectively uh,
Mm.
baseless reasons. And yet I can trace where some of my naiveties in the past may have contributed to some sense of tension, or sense of, well, that meeting didn't go as meetings usually go, and I maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable now.
Mm.
People can read into that in a million ways, and actually, the truth of it is extremely innocent. I'm here really speaking abstractly to uh, such such minor, such minor discretions. And yet it's so interesting. I'm going a bit all over the place, so I do apologize,
Please
but I
go for
can
it.
I
That's
can give it
fine.
an example from football recently. I often make this point, a similar line of logic, and I think there's something here, but it's a slightly more on the edge, and you can read it. You can be skeptical of me here for sure, but so I'm on the subs bench. I've come off for a rest, and one of their players on the pitch ends up pulling one of our guys' heads from behind and kind of tries to get him in a headlock. And then our guy kind of like swings around and pushes him off. And it's a bit of a swing, and they break it up, and no big deal. No one connected with any arms, but their bench has gone off massively. and I've kind of gone over there a little bit, and I'm not like shouting at them, but I'm like, I'm being vocal in response. I can't even remember what I said. No insulting or anything like that, but it was like I probably said something like, "Your guy went for him. Your guy went for him," and they're just screaming all this stuff, whatever. Um, I'm actually, uh, I'm not being particularly confrontational, but I'm being present on the channel and I'm staying open to meeting. Kind of like I can see the little glint of a smile. They know they're taking the piss a bit, but they're also wanting to get aggressive and they're wanting to get the ref on side. And then my coach, who's a friend of mine and certainly trusts me, he tells me to come back. But he really wants me to stop, actually, because he's getting a little bit, inflamed, right? Now, in these situations, I probably am the combination of most capable of projecting my voice while remaining measured. And everybody would know that. And yet, I'm also someone who can then be told, come back, because I'm like, I can see, like, okay, I'll do as you ask. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a certain like
Yeah.
the the uh there's a few things to link together here. I'll give another example, which is a similar line of logic. Um, Sometimes I've experienced that, let's say there's someone who's relatively famous and has a lot of people contacting them, and you have a relationship with them, and it's actually been built on a good foundation of real humanness, and there's actually real mutual care there. But they're tired and they've got all these people wanting their attention, and they know that actually they can kind of, with you, share that, I need a break, and I can't really communicate that in the same way to others. So I kind of have to be available. But from you, I'm going to need a break. And I know that you know that. And I know that you'll accept it. And that's all fine. And then, but what at the end of the day happens is, in this case, I don't get to spend time with the person and they end up being called into relation and collaborative possibilities from people who aren't being as sensitive to what the relationship needs. And so I do kind of notice something like that as a phenomena
Yes.
occur often. How I'm going to link it back to some other things I've learned might take me a few seconds. But I'm sharing that anyway because I do think there's a phenomena in there that ends up confounding. It does end up confounding, uh, I guess, like it ends up confounding, I guess, like extending the relational possibility in favor of uh, preserving its energy, which is,
Yeah.
in the one hand, it's got merit, but as a scaled phenomenon, something like that, and not really being able to invest properly in the people who are showing that they will respect you enough to leave you alone ends up being an issue. And people can become blind to that in various ways. And of course, someone could just say, well, actually, they just didn't want to talk to you. So there's always the background, but I think there's something there. So I'll maybe just leave that and I want to come back to some of the other threads. So I apologize to those people listening, but I think we'll get there.
This is great. This is fantastic. Yeah, there's a very real cost and downside and pain, and sometimes even loneliness, that can come from being, if I put it in my simple terms, being the one who is willing to be vulnerable and open and sort of really work on building the deeper intimacy in a relationship. Um, there is that edge to it, because you can often become the one that is the first person to be sort of put on hold, if you will, for the reasons that you're outlining there, because I know you'll understand. I know the others won't, right? I think that's a really important point that you make there. I mean, I would contend that there is something there of a courage, if we're going to put that term on it, which I will, a courage required of the other person there, though, that perhaps is maybe slightly lacking. I know I'm keeping it to a very specific example, and you're talking about something broader, but there is something to be said for making that kind of decision.
Well, on that, Aspasia, if there does seem to me a very deep and just tragic truth there, which is that we are, in fact, extremely vulnerable to other, we are extremely vulnerable, and I just, one only has to live a life or read a book, it's
Yeah.
we are, and I believe this, we're all involved in justice, we all participate in justice. We'll participate in meaning. Justice isn't just something to be decreed from some big other. And you know, sometimes we are cut down. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess people are afraid of being cut down and maybe it would do me well to affirm a more affirm a certain courage, perhaps that I've shown at times. I really don't frame things that way to myself, but I do hold myself to I hold myself to that, but I don't, if one, thinks of oneself as a certain way, you want to hold that carefully. Do you know what I mean? It's the label isn't going to get you there. I'm not really one for fake it till you make it. I have to say, some people do that. And I guess people argue for a certain truth to it. You don't have to be more courageous than you are. You just have to actually try where you are. So,
That is the courage. It's the vulnerability of where you're at. Courage, like, it's not the same thing as saying that you are confident, or it's just that it's the willingness to engage from a more stripped down position of where you're at. And sometimes that can be as simple as asking the question that's on your mind that you think everyone else is going to think is stupid and obvious, if we put it in simple terms. And also being courageous to make the kinds of decisions in relationships where you prioritize something that feels most beautiful to you, knowing that a large amount of people around you would never understand that kind of decision. Or my mind keeps going back to that example that you were just giving, at the last one that you gave there. And actually, for someone to be able to say, to be able to reflect to the degree that they might realize it's actually quite a punishment to someone that I say to them, because I know you'll understand, I'm going to tell you that I don't have time for you right now while I see others. That's a kind of punishment. So I guess if I go back to that example, I'm just thinking about what it would take for someone to be able to say, actually, that's going to require me now to say no to these other people who I know won't understand me saying no. And that's going to feel painful and uncomfortable for me and may have a range of repercussions and whatever. But that's what I mean. It's about sort of standing standing up in a manner that that is in my estimation at least more human in that respect.
Yeah,
But you know,
it would
yeah.
look it's tricky. One of the things that I also think is really on the edge for continuing to make progress, at least across some of these dimensions of
Mhm.
social, philosophical connectivity is, give me a second, it's here. Yeah, I'm sure we would have spoken about this before. For, imagine the example of a relationship, an intimate relationship. How could you ever ask somebody in advance all that entering a relationship with you will in fact entail,
Mm.
right? Uh,
Yeah. Mhm.
it's you can't. And so when it comes to inviting or agreeing to, well, a context of conversation or transformation that cannot be pre-specified in outcome, then what constitutes a sufficient ethics of that invitation? In part, that's also mediated by the time and energy it takes to actually receive the invitation.
Yeah.
And that then ends up, navigating that. It's right in the
Mm.
it's right in the liminal before the relationship is actually
Yeah.
um it can't be, it can be everything up until the relationship sort of commences is sort of, there's room for plausible deniability or something like this. Once you've established a relationship, then you can't really appeal to the same sorts of things, right? But so there's
Mm.
a lot of that. And I do think one of the challenges is, well, I guess I'll say something else. It's potentially a little bit, somewhat radical-ish, but a basic point would just be to say, like, gatekeepers are very unlikely to be capable of discerning what kind of intimacy should be happening inside the gates, because a lot of those gatekeepers are only allowed at the gatehouse. They don't even know what's going on. Now, of course, that's not the case for everybody, and you can have contexts which have much more discerning membranes. But it is, I would say, the case that whether it's government, business, philanthropy, all manner of contexts, in the whatever is the center of whatever the context is, itself may not be particularly capable of making discernments as to what kinds of transformative processes it should be or would be valuable to undergo. To give another completely sort of different example, take psychedelics or any number of profound experiences or medicines, pharmakon. It's pharmakon is the point, right? Is it a cure? Is it poison? And you know, many people lack the discernment about how to relate with the various pharmacons that are most essential to navigating in our time. And I do think that philosophy is one of those, like, pharmacons par excellence, and that I really think that philosophy as an institutional thing is just it's a shell. It's not even a shell because it's not even a true outside face. It's got really not even a helpful protective function. I don't even know what to call it, but it's so emaciated
Mm,
academically of the kind of skin in the game, entangled participation with understanding and life that it's just one additional factor which confuses people's understanding about what philosophy even is. But it is, it is you can take the lens of the pharmakon onto so many important things, but I think philosophy is one of those. And it mostly seems like it's it's oftentimes just reduced to mere instrumental value. Um, who actually wants to? The issue is just as a culture, the commons of communication and the commons of shared participation and understanding is just subject to war, basically, subject to manipulation, mistreatment through often through ignorance, often as well through targeted manipulative efforts to control a population this way or that way.
mm,
And but even among those who in principle would be for something like democracy, some sort of civic fabric of interaction, some philosophy, some all of that wiser communication, I think that the I still think that the um many of the people who proclaim themselves to be such or interested in such are particularly good at telling poison from remedy and
You think they are or aren't? I missed that.
aren't aren't I don't think so. I think it's partly because you actually got to swallow some poison. you
Yes.
know you got to swallow some poison. um
Yes.
and and so when it comes and
Mm,
and hilarious that I've used that as language for a number of reasons. This is where, to really take this conversation on is partly why, Voicecraft has value, because it's something which is wanting to also care for the membranes of distributing and including people in conversation, because there are so many of the people who listen to your conversations who actually do want to speak to you in exactly the same spirit and would be open to risking a whole lot of trust in. And yet also, I want to be careful around, because I could tell some very interesting stories, right? Which are stories that I do think are really relevant for our mutual work here together with respect to everything we're speaking about. And yet, there's got to be, I think, at this point, the right fireplace to tell those stories around. But, you know, and by take some poison, I do mean, to discern and spit out. I mean,
I know.
this is not about infecting people, right? But it is about inoculating people appropriately. And that is,
Yeah.
and so I do like the thing is there's part of me that has always, recognized the importance of playing with the edge.
Yes.
And but it comes from a place of caring about the edges in relation. But the thing is that, and here's the thing, in in the present moment of my life, as far as all of my philosophical efforts and seeking in this life has found, I still believe it's appropriate for, in a sense, the whole world to hang on on trust that we invest in each other and ourselves. And that is of a quality that it really, it's not something that can be brought to a an absolute specification, because it's always the trust also is how are we interpreting and relating to what has been pre-specified, just to name one thing.
Mm,
And and so I really I do prefer still to sort of progress in relationship on the basis of whether we are capable of mutually trusting each other without that having to be adjudicated by something neither of us can are actually ready to name yet. But can we bring ourselves to the process of naming it together? Yes, absolutely. We can attempt to do so, like, and we can make commitments and form contracts and all of that. And uh, and we do need to move towards doing more of that. Except I mean that still, I think I still mean that, somewhat abstractly, because I guess what's also within me is that I have a pretty big distrust of our legal institutions. And I basically see that my walk around perspective is that the integrity of the word has been just mistreated for so long that I don't believe our legal systems select for lawyers who care, who fundamentally attain their positions because they've cared for the word, but because they've played the game of interpretation of the word within a construct that is bound more toward power. And there is some beautiful stuff in there. Like, of course, it's been so hard won, this whole legislative capacity we have. So I'm not being basic about this, but at the same time, you know, everything from the level of insurance to the legal system, it does feel to me that so much that is binding the world together, while it serves a purpose and is in effect sort of patching up the ship, so to speak, that there's there's a and you talk about sort of nourishment and what really rejuvenates spirit and what have you. I do think if a context isn't capable of sharing voice in a manner that sort of sources from that which is in is inherently unbound, but in itself affirms binding, something like that. So it's not there again, there'd be a better way to say this. This would be the kind of thing I could write better, but yeah, it, it's in many ways it's the same sort of point that we've been making over and over again, and and why make it over and over again? I guess like
mm,
once people start to get elements of it, there is a certain value in the repetition, because it seems like once people are getting it, then there's okay, now I'm strengthening my capacity. In terms of how effective the communication is at actually holding the attention of people who aren't getting it.
mm.
But then the question is, how much do you want to hold anyone's attention who isn't actually getting it? And then there's a question of, are we being sensitive to who's actually listening?
Yeah,
In
sure.
which case, well, we're just showing up on the medium, and it is what it is. The project of caring about the membranes of who's actually listening and in participation is itself part of this whole conversation. We're just speaking to one aspect of it. Anyway, I'll bring it to a close there and pass it back to you. But
I laughed there for a moment because you said, when you were saying this is something you would write better about than speak. This is something I have struggled with for so long. I mean, I won't go on a massive tangent now. We can talk about it another time. But you know, I often leave these conversations, and that's when the stuff that I actually want to say comes to me. You know, and often through writing as well. It's something that comes through the process of writing, and trying to. Yeah, there's something about that. But I want to go back. That was going sideways. There's something in all of that that I keep thinking about, the difference between sort of like a and you use the word care, which is really important in all of this. There's like a carelessness that so many other people I might see online that I see in some of what they're doing. And I know that that's, you know, I'm putting a judgment on what I'm seeing, but that's the sense I get. So okay, how do I tie this together? So one other thing that's quite apparent about you, Tim, in these spaces is you have a very particular way of speaking, right? Yeah.
yeah.
A beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing, but it's a very particular way of speaking, right? And you know, I'll never forget the first few kind of voice crafts that I joined, and I was just trying. I was like, oh. It's like you use language in this way that really does feel like you're knitting. I don't know how else to explain it. Like I just can't keep up with the knitting needles, but like for a while there, but that never became an experience for me of this is someone just like spewing out a whole lot of words. Do you know what I mean? That's why it felt like knitting, and I just wasn't keeping up with the needles. It wasn't like and that's what I mean by carelessness. It wasn't just a spewing out spontaneously a whole lot of long words. There was something about it that it reminded me of reading poetry. And the way that I would read books when I was really young, which was I would read books and I didn't know what lots of the words meant. None of the actual, I didn't really understand what I was reading, but I loved reading them. And they had, you know, they are books that I return to now, and I love in a different way. But because anyway, you follow what I'm saying. There's a difference here between, and I'm just trying to use this as an example of something broader, between I guess if I just put it simply, and I hope you understand what I mean by this, Tim. I know you well enough. I think you will. Someone could, if they wanted to, kind of view maybe the way that you speak in some of these conversations in a particular way, right?
And they certainly do.
They definitely do. And it might be seen as sort of well, you could say pretentious, right? Because of just
all manner of insults I've experienced, both in person, in comment, for years, among many, all possible ways. Not all, I mean, people can be endlessly creative, but whatever the dimensions of the negativity are, I have experienced so many times. So I'm absolutely with you, and I understand
yes.
where people are coming from.
Yes. And then there's also, I think, a way that's for some people, they might view it as kind of a rigidity, if you will, as well, right? So I'm pointing these ones out for a particular reason, because so when I say rigidity, sort of like a in the knitting, in the not just saying something in a concise one sentence, but continuing to knit, if you will. It might, I think there can be an experience sometimes of a like, why are you still sort of doing that? That's what I mean by rigidity. You know what I mean? Like let go, like sort of, you know, you've said the thing, like I know why you're doing it, but I'm just trying to paint a picture of something that could appear one way or be experienced one way. The reason I point this out is because there's something that keeps coming to my mind during this whole conversation about sensing the difference between so spontaneity is deeply important here. There's something about creating contexts where people feel when they're ready and as they want to, having to have moments where they, and this goes to the edges thing, you know, being willing to, maybe the courage and the bravery I've been talking about, being willing to sort of speak from their edge in that moment, which can be a bit like spontaneity. That's kind of what I'm calling spontaneity in this way. Uh, and that is very different though, but that's a kind of a moments thing, like moments of that. But do you know what I'm getting? That's very
Yeah,
different
yeah, yeah. No,
standing
no.
somewhere and just spewing out carelessly a whole lot of
Yes.
stuff.
Yes. No, no, I get you. I mean, I've written some essays now over the years and some recently. Again, I've had some very interesting experiences over the last few years with very strong people very forcefully having negative impressions of me in a way that you're sort of describing here. Um, and there's some interesting things there, and we could speak about it. But if I just work with an element now, which comes through as something that's quite significant, and again, quite provocative in a sense, I am attempting to speak as clearly as possible about the 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 most sacred things.
Yeah, I
So
know. I know it's great.
so and so and so that's a good way to put it, right? And so the question is, if one is really endeavoring to speak with clarity about the most sacred things, then what should one index on? You know,
That's what I mean.
should,
Yeah, your
you
edge.
know,
Yeah.
uh, now sometimes, we can do better or worse than that. There's also, and we've spoken about how some people can maybe, if they see someone who's a leader of something expressing uncertainty, they might think not a good leader, doesn't know where he or she is going.
Hmm. Yeah.
And there's a similar sort of point here, um, around it's on the one hand, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything, and at the same time, I am endeavoring to cultivate
Mm.
an opening in conversational possibility where the deepest aspects of who and what we are and what we believe can be met. And if it's the case that they are sufficiently meaningful and deep, that we care about them so much, and that they are actually met, and if one, one can feel pressed in all manner of ways. And
Yeah.
now there's a couple things happening at once as we move toward that in conversation in general. And one is taking place at the level of sort of affective trust, totally separate from intellectual understanding. And then the understanding or the intellectual understanding can also influence one's sense of trust. I'm not following, I don't trust you now, or I don't trust you, so I don't want to accept the way
Mm.
these things end up going back and forth on each other and
They're not feeling safe.
not feeling safe. And so,
Mm.
it is very interesting though, because I am very sensitive to when someone is listening and feeling as though they're on the journey with what I'm expressing and that it's going somewhere worthwhile. And of course, there's a skill aspect to all of this. And sometimes, right, but saying that I'm doing at least an 80% job and it's like fine, they can, they're appreciating that I'm going somewhere. I've always felt that the expression in Voicecraft, from anyone, is that the voice that's moving the conversation is in a sense constituted by the collective voice, the collective receptivity that is enabling that voice to continue. And so the quality, so this is maybe for people who are trying to understand, maybe when maybe you've had the experience of when someone is actually willing you to continue, it is possible for you to speak more. Whereas when someone wants you to stop, or they really don't like what you're saying, or they're angered by or frustrated by it, and if you want to stay in the same collaborative place with that, then it can make it impossible to say anything more because you know it would, in a sense, be a waste because they're not going on the journey with you and it's just frustrating them even more. And so that means, in part, that the receiver is tremendously influencing the possibility of what can be expressed. And so, for then people to have a third person perspective on what's going on there, they might not have a clue of whether or not, like, someone is in fact willing that expression to continue and where the boundaries of it are. And so there's many ways to be confused in that regard. Um, you know, I I attempt when someone is really genuinely earnest in this sincere in wanting to understand something and is asking me about it and actually cares for what I can share about that, then I do, I see the very depths of my own wrestle with that as I can bring it to presence with them in the moment as the way to honor that maximally. I
Yeah.
from the perspective of the kind of expression that, would work really well in a YouTube short or an
Mhm.
Instagram short, having something that can be rendered in clear, a linear progression with the right sort of recap. You should watch how the Gen Z people are able to talk about analyzing Instagram clips. And of course, not just Gen Z, but like what's hooking, what's like, uh, what's the total addressable market of who can understand, then what's hooking, and then what's kind of an open loop, closed loop. There are all these hacked, basically gamed ways of working with attention,
Mhm.
and none of that, the approach toward that, you have to, like, for me, it's like unbelievable levels of world-class art can attain that kind of attentional value while also embodying a real source expression of the kind of open relationality that can actually be met, right? Because I'm showing up in a way, it's like
Yeah.
there are breadcrumbs to follow that, like, where people can actually enter a relationship with me, and I am fundamentally accountable and I have no issues being accountable. I desire to be accountable to what follows on there, right? Now, part of it is also there's layers of not making it too easy, like not making the offer in that sense too cheap, and not being able to actually substantiate it. But the truth is that this expression is open to relationship. Now, for the most part, if you listen to people speak on podcasts and different things, they don't actually want you joining their community. They might want you writing some comments or whatever, but it's a total charade.
Yes.
It's absolute bullshit. And so, but how, like, Voicecraft is not a cult, right? It's not a place for gurus. It's not a place to worship how someone expresses above all others. It's a place that it cares for whether or not the communication is vital, is can be joined and participated in. And for someone who really wants to take seriously what it is to actually cultivate, from my perspective anyway, cultivate that vitality of communication, then what shows up as caring for that at a level of how you and I can reflect about what needs to be present on it, you know, um, again, like it's hilarious. Like it can't be copied. You can't copy paste it. You know, you can't copy paste it. There is something I want to come back to, which I know I mentioned something about reputational, and then I didn't even go into it, and it seems like a funny thing to leave in there. But it's there now, and that is what it is. I eventually want to be able to talk about these things more openly, and then the usage of pharmakon I think is super interesting, and like, and the different ways that um, I somewhat just think that the different kinds of paradoxes and room to interpret this way or that way, depending on what's going on here. I do kind of think it's necessary, and you know, and it's partly because it's a little bit like Zen koan type stuff,
Yeah.
but I'm finding my way through that. It's like
Mm.
I'll give you a story um of like when I've like discerned uh that I've needed to have very strong boundaries, right? And I think this person is genuinely, you know, a fair way towards psychopathic. And this is many, many years ago. I haven't really, don't even think I've seen them since. I might have seen them a couple months later at an event, but this is going back, 7, 8 years. I knew that this person wanted to stay overnight in the house that I was staying in, for a short period of time with 5 or 6 other people who'd come together for about 4 or 5 days. And we didn't, a couple of us knew each other, a couple of us didn't. Um, and this person didn't have anywhere to stay, but that was of their own choosing, and they were totally fine. They had purposefully not really organized anything because they wanted to, let's say, sleep in the same room as a particular woman who was part of the thing.
Got it.
And the way that this person was attempting to manipulate me to sort of to incept me with the desire or the idea to offer him my room as a place to stay, it was so like there. And
Yeah.
I sort of met that with a sort of feigned ignorance. So on the one hand, like
Mm.
I was like, I wanted to communicate to him that uh, on the one hand, I was offering like the game of I don't understand what you're saying, so I don't know how to give you this thing, while at the same time holding at another level to I'm not backing away, I'm looking you right in the eyes, here we are, and there's an easy way for us to both to go our separate ways here, but within the context of the communication, I am going to show up as an ignorant idiot who just can't follow how intelligent you are,
Mhm.
while at the same time not giving you what you want. So it's
Mhm.
like these different layers of like navigating that situation. I'm not saying it was
Save-
right to do.
That saves something, that offer, right? It preserves something of the relationship too, right?
It preserve yes, exactly. It preserves something of the relationship. Um, so
Mm.
now, why am I giving that as an example in the context of speaking in a way that's something like a koan? Okay, this is another thing that I attempted to communicate at the end of a talk I did at Esoteric the first time. It was about violence,
Mhm.
and it was about like the appropriateness of turning to violence when that moment comes.
Yep.
It's something to do with it's really being like sort of as conscious as possible, um until there's no there's until there's no longer any time for that, you know but there is a sort of a widening and strengthening of our capacity to be conscious before that kinetic ballistic, which I do think again is this orientation toward maturity.
The stretching of a muscle. It's like a stretching.
Stretch, yeah, it's a great analogy. I do wonder. about some extra additional dimensional analogies there as well. But benching that,
Mm.
the part of the what's at stake in Voicecraft is its um, protectiveness, its capacity to protect itself from predation, right? And real psychopathic behavior and co-opting of all different kinds. And it's wanting to be a kind of communication. It's nothing if it's not also something that can avail itself to a particular quality of orientation in communication that exists in times of war, although it is primarily something that wants to be strengthening capacity in times of relative peace. But it has to include the dimension of war. But it has to do that non-naively and non-trivially, or minimum necessary kind of naivety, basically, because naivety has kind of been a running theme of this, and there's always going to be risk, there's always going to be that trust element, always that possibility of betrayal, all of that, which has all been part of the conversation. But it has to be like a meaningful
Yeah.
development or an like an actually cultivate. It has to, it can't just be some bullshit attempt. It has to be like what's quality about it. And so, because a lot of the critiques people have had about different contexts for communication is that they can be gamed. People can come in, learn the language, parrot it, act like this. And so I'm not consciously trying to speak like I do because people can't emulate it or what have you. That's not the case. And, anyone can emulate being confused. We just have to be confused. So it is possible to talk like I am in many of the ways we can all show up in ways that can be experienced by others in these particular qualities of negativity. But there is, I do believe there's something philosophically significant about the about knowing and cultivating a trust in the whether it's the commons of communication, the channel, the connectivity between us that constitute us, that we're entangled with, all of that, that participation in that is itself constitutes the cultivation of a kind of membrane, and is the participation is itself protective. It's not to say you can't be overpowered by something, and
Yeah.
it's to the point where even if a camera is on you, it can never actually be it, it it's not in it can't be you have to you have to go on the journey. You have to actually care to be in participation, to actually receive the truth of the transmission, the truth in its making, to actually participate in the whole making. And so in a sense it's like the care itself becomes something which is protective.
Yes.
And so, if I'm talking about something that's extremely difficult and matters a lot, and I'm also trying to speak about it with clarity because I have a certain responsibility to it, then it's like, you have to, like, caring about what's attempting to be spoken as something which, because it's in a sense a kind of a transcendent, and that many people can endeavor to speak free. You don't have to Ideally, you don't have to care about me to care about hearing it, although it'd be nice, like I'm not against that because I need help. But 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 in principle, caring, like noticing that the endeavor is being valued is what can hopefully offer that bridge into caring to actually participate in going on that weave, that journey, that open-ended journey. And then now we've distinguished between people who care enough to participate in the conversation and people who don't. And the only way you can contribute at the level of real integrity, but also magic to the ongoingness of the craft, right, is through the care. So there'd be a way to clarify that more, but I do think that's a powerful argument.
It's like it coats, the care coats the whole thing with something. Yeah, it's you said there were a couple of things that felt weird to kind of throw out and not come back to. Do you want to come back to them?
Um, well, I could probably, given where we just arrived at, I could probably tie something together which offers a little bit of an address. So I would quickly
Right,
do that,
right. Yeah.
which is that the one of the ways that I think I've experienced some people not be sure about me as a poison or remedy to their particular contexts is because I'd say it's the most charitable case to make of their interpretive, most charitable interpretation to make of their treatment is that there's something that has been misperceived. There's been a mismatch in initiating the joining in mutual care for the conversation, and that the perception of me of a certain intensity or depth or care with respect to that is, well, I'll say too much for them. Now, it might technically be too much for them, i.e., like some of those people might be in inappropriate places of authority with respect to the memes and the endeavors that they're taking on. And so, in that regard, can be profoundly challenging for reasons that we could make a case as like for the right reasons, in which case it's kind of necessary to interact with someone who receives like good intention and mistreats it,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and that is part of the risk, and I think that's a serious part of the world, in which case we have to be strategic about that as well to link up with earlier things.
Mm.
And then there's, an altogether more innocent misunderstanding and a whole, selection of those, in which case we then, regardless, come back to the same kind of base and consider, you know, how we're showing up, how to support the context, what kind of design can be enabled, when one might be giving too much, when is one actually leaving oneself out to be projected onto or scapegoated or all manner of things which actually aren't in the interest of anyone. And all I'll notice is that, you know, in very on the one hand, in such innocuous, it's kind of obvious in a way, but and sometimes you can be randomly, like someone can come and hit you in the back of the head randomly on the street and no one could really say you could have done differently. Like what kind of attunement could you have had or an earthquake hits? But I think a lot of the time there is also a lack of attunement regarding what violence could be brewing nearby. And
Mhm. Mhm.
so there's sort of an onward journey of that. And ah, there's a right, there was a good point there. I guess I just also, it's really important to, for me, it is really important to get the sense of where someone is and what their capacities are, so I know what possible depth it's possible to commit to going into them with. None of this is like on the one hand, like you can end up wasting so much time, but I, don't have time to waste. And so there would be ways to tie this together now, which I'm currently unable of doing in the time constraints we have. I guess why I even mention stuff like reputation, partly because I do think that we I've experienced enough bullshit that is disenabling of the kind of federation among aspects of the kind of ecology that in principle cares about wisdom
Mm,
and problems of particular scale that, you know, the the
mm,
there has to be an evolution of how certain dynamics can be brought into civic discourse. And I'm just knocking on the door a little bit of that. And
mm,
I guess I'm more sort of calling out to people who really care to listen that these kinds of problems remain in a way like more fundamental from my perspective anyway than so many of the crises as labeled, whether in climate or whatever it is.
mm,
And I think the game of strategy and subterfuge and manipulation and broadcast and
mm,
intelligence agencies and influence, and there's just like it really can only continue to go. There's nothing that philosophically, there's nothing particularly philosophically interesting about it in terms of evolving and really wrestling with the deep questions and the transformative questions. I think that point I made toward like what the possibilities for understanding are and collaboration are and living are, and if 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 care is actually part of the fabric of what enables and protects the connection in communication at all, it's a different it's a whole different world. It's a whole different world of possibility. And you just don't there's just no way to bullshit or even particularly strategize one's way there primarily. We can be strategic in terms of like, well, how many seats around a table do we need? Like there's plenty. I'm not against strategy as a whole thing, but anyway,
yeah.
yeah, there's lots there. I'm sorry I couldn't be a little bit more clear, but I feel like we've got some important
Apologies.
things in
No
the
apologies. You've no, please, no apologies. This is all wonderful. Yeah, it's all yeah, it's also there's just the the being open to the possibility space in terms of that which you cannot possibly know at this point though, like I just think, there's a lot of posing and a lot of I guess playing at the level of um having particular outcomes in mind, and yeah, anyway, I'm going to make a big mess of it now, so I'm going to shut up. um that was really fun and really helpful, Tim. I really appreciated that. I hope there was something in that of value for you.
of
I
massively so. Some beautiful, absolutely beautiful opportunities in there, and I really appreciate how you how you were open and heard me and how you began the conversation. And it's a special place for me to share that story of my grandfather as well. And I think we actually did come to a place that does, in this format of expression, I think actually really, develop something that I think is philosophically profound. Like I think and again, I say again, basic, simple at the level of it's like the concrete obviousness of what makes life possible. And of course, it is in our time, given the complexity of everything we're actually relating with and what we are as human beings in communication, and to differentiate as well from, you know, that which, you know, might appear similar, but which is not actually committing to build from the same basis. And of course, there are many people that are, but
Yeah.
there we are. Not everybody is.
Yeah. And there's something to the when you're really in relationship like that, the importance of there is a kind of a wrestling with things, and there is a willingness to step into the scarier places and the edges, and to feel your anxiety in the mix of it. And it's not, I think sometimes what happens too in these other spaces that kind of attempt to look that way, is there is just way too much focus too sometimes on comfort, or feeling too open. But I think you know what I mean by that. Like, just like, again, it goes back to that carelessness thing. So there's just, yeah, there's something very special anyway that has been cultivated at Voicecraft, and speaking with you has been, yeah, it's been extraordinary. And I'm really sad, actually, that I have to wrap it up, because I
Yeah,
feel quite
no, we wrap it up. Probably we cut as long as you include that first 5 minutes, then maybe the next 2 hours of I think my progressively weaving it into a more and more impossible place to follow along for everybody that isn't actually in participation with Voicecraft. Do you know what I mean? That's kind of how I feel like that's kind of how it went. And so I kind of mean that with due openness and I suppose closedness in a strange way, right? It's oh, isn't it interesting? It's like how much of us actually is meant to be interesting to lots of people versus how much of us is meant to be interesting to a small amount of people. And it's like, you know, I'm sure later on today, you'll have so many meaningful, significant things like with your son coming home sick, right? It's like just as meaningful in so many ways, but like not as many people going to be interested in the broadcast recounting of what's about to happen over the next 45 minutes. And yet, it has to find its, but yet that has to come through in your actual life in order for that care. And so that
yeah.
itself is an interesting reflection onto this, right? And so maybe with that, I'll ask for a little bit of grace. And I want to care for everyone who's potentially listening, but at the same time, it would like probably be technically inappropriate for like what actually has to be cultivated and built. And that is very different from the guru mode of expression, which always wants to like capture, it's capturing all of it. And no, it's not that, but the openness to be in relation with all of it. But it's also, in a sense, well, this was an interaction between Tim and Aspasia in the context of Aspasia's channel, and so that's what this is in part. So anyway, thank you. It's thank you.
You're very welcome. I think what you're sketching out there at the end is just also the difference between a care for genuine intimacy versus something more like a seduction. It's
Mm, that's right. That's the thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the pushing away at the same time, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah,
it
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And seduction is a very protected, ultimately underneath you're very protected in it, but you get to feel a sense of
Mm.
mastery, and
Oh, well, let's have a session on this, hey?
I would
You
love to.
know,
That's one of my
let's
favorite
have a,
topics:
yeah,
intimacy
yeah, yeah.
versus seduction.
Attraction, seduction. No, amazing. I think we should return to that. We'd
All
have a
right.
session on that for sure. All right.
I'm
Bye bye.
alive. I'm alive now, Tim. I'm ready for all the sessions.
Amazing.